So good evening, everyone. On behalf of Nalsar Public Policy Group, I welcome you all to the panel discussion on Me Too Revisited, the power of solidarity. The aim of the talk is to revisit the painful yet courageous episode of self-empowerment and shared solidarity among women and non-binary folk that caused disruptions and eruptions across all the male-dominated world. We have three wonderful speakers joining us today. Nikita Sonavne, Vikramaditya Sahai, and Rituparna Chatterjee. The talk will be moderated by our very own Professor Vasanthi. For all those who are joining us today, I would give a short introduction for our esteemed panelists and a moderator for the event. Ms. Nikita Sonavne has worked as a legal researcher and as an advocate for over 3 years. She is a co-founder of Criminal Justice and Police Accountability Project. She has previously worked as a research associate with the Center for Social Justice, Ahmedabad, on the issues related to local governance, forest rights, and gender in the Adivasi region of Dang in Gujarat. We welcome you, ma'am. Vikram Aditya Sahai is a researcher and teacher with Center for Law and Policy Research, Bangalore. They are a postgraduate in political science from University of Delhi. They have previously worked as a faculty at the Gender Studies Department, Ambedkar University, Delhi, and as a consultant on a project to study non-normative sexuality and gender housed at the Advanced Center for Women's Studies, TIFF, Bombay. They are interested in sex, feeling, and structure and narrative of living in their relations with forms of sociality, law, and politics. We welcome you, Vikram. Ms. Rituparna Chatterjee is an intersectional feminist editor with close to 2 decades of experience and one of the founding editors of HuffPost India. She covers press freedom in the subcontinent for the Reporters Without Borders, and she writes for multiple Indian and foreign media organizations. She is a workplace sexual harassment prevention campaigner, runs the @IncomeTo Twitter handle, and leverages social media platforms to build conversation circles on work, gender, feminism, and sexual violence. We welcome you, ma'am. Professor Vasanthi teaches at Nalsar University of Law and our moderator for today, Professor Vasanthi teaches at Nalsar University of Law and has headed the ICC at Nalsar for many years. He was instrumental in setting up a student support group on gender-based harassment on campus and has worked as an external member on several ICCs in Hyderabad. She is presently a member of a high-level committee set up to address sexual harassment in the Telugu film industry. Thank you for joining us, ma'am. Thank you all for taking out time from your busy schedules to join us today. I would like to hand it over to Professor Vasanthi to commence the panel discussion.
Thank you, Leher, and a very warm welcome to all the attendees. I would especially like to thank our panelists for giving us time to host this session. And of course, I would really like to congratulate the Public Policy Group for putting this together. It has been a long-standing demand of mine that the Public Policy Group hasn't really addressed this question, which I thought was something that should be discussed at a law school, and because it has so many consequences for our understanding of law. And it points out so many gaps in the way in which we assume that the law can take care of so many things. What the Me Too movement has to show up in the law in terms of assuming that just because you have legislation in place or just because you have institutions in space, things take care of themselves. And I think what the Me Too movements at various points of time have thrown up is that the inadequacies of the law are constantly something that all of us who are engaged with law must realize. So while the Me Too movement has challenged the law, it has also been, and from my own experience, the panel that was set up, the high-level committee that was set up by the government of Telangana, followed a Me Too movement by the junior artists in the Telugu film industry. So unlike other places where you had, persons who were much higher up in the hierarchy who came up and spoke about harassment, what happened in the Telugu film industry with the junior artists, those invisible women who are nameless and faceless, were the ones who led the movement. And after that incident, you had this very publicized show of protest by a female artist who was not exactly a junior artist, but she really threw the issue into the public domain by stripping in protest in front of the film chambers. So this brought about the complicity of the various structures in the film industry in addressing questions of harassment. And the cause was taken up by several women's groups in Hyderabad who filed a writ petition, and then the high level committee got constituted. And the committee is, for the first time, providing an opportunity for these various actors in the industry to talk about it. So the Me Too movement has had both aspects. It has thrown up challenges for the law. It has also pushed the law to act in certain ways. It has pushed the persons in power and responsibility towards more accountability. And so for me, it has had so many shades that I think it's almost impossible to try and say that this is what the movement, or whether it's a movement or not, this is what it's been about. And I don't think it would end at any particular point of time, because this has been about speaking up and speaking out. And so with these very few words, I'd like to really hear from the panelists. And we will start with just 10 minutes on just reflections on the topic. We will take some questions from the audience, and then we will have another round of either you can respond to what each of you have said, or you can respond to the questions which are raised. And the order that we are tentatively setting up is that we will start with Rituparna, we'll move to Nikita, and Vikram will come at the end. So I invite Rituparna to begin her reflections.
Thank you so much. So I'm not a lawyer, I'm a journalist. I'll talk from sort of my experience in the last 3 years, and they haven't always been pleasant. Mostly, they have taken a huge, mental toll on many people who sort of raise their hands and step forward to share stories, listen to stories, and sort of help as volunteers during a time. A lot of people were sharing their personal stories, and a lot of people, more importantly, a lot of people who couldn't, because either they didn't have the platform. We often make the mistake of assuming that people don't have a voice. People have a voice, which there are a lot of learnings that I've had in the last 3 years. One of which is, and I think I'm not just speaking for myself, but a lot of other individuals, is they have, since 2018 October, the scrutiny that we've had, even of ourselves, our own selves, as women, as people of privilege, um, and it sort of changed. We sort of seen the issue, and through a different lens. There have been so many learnings, and one of which is that people don't lack voice. People just sort of don't lack the mic. They lack the platform. And even when it started, I don't know whether it's a movement, whether it's a collective collection of voices who stood up to sort of be counted in something that is as insidious as sexual abuse. Um, what it did was, at least for me, as a survivor myself, is helped me feel a little less lonely, where I was, and I feel that that feeling extended to a lot of people as well. Very early on in the movement, I'll just quickly, I won't take much time introducing this, but very early on, I had the opportunity to speak to Tarana Burke, who started the Me Too movement, as we all know, in America. A year earlier, in 2017, I've had the opportunity also to speak to Raya Sarkar. I've been in touch with Raya ever since. Tarana, I've interviewed her for like a project. And what was wonderful is, and what was a little, sort of offbeat, is also that the way Indians, the way media looked at the movement here is very entirely different from what Tarana, the whole philosophy around the victim centered, survivor centered movement she hoped, to start and started in America. The drastic difference in how we approach survivors of sexual violence, and one of the key factors in it is we over here, it's always been the question of who is the perpetrator, and what has been done. One of the biggest um, adverse effect of the last 3 years has been the media's role in how they covered the Me Too movement, and one of which is they took away the spotlight. Actually, I felt from the survivor stories and centered it on the who is being accused of and who is being named, which um, it is supposed to be a movement of solidarity. Solidarity is a very strong word. It is supposed to be people coming together to raise their hands and share in this very global experience that all of us have been through. All of us, I don't know a single person who hasn't had one experience in their lives where they've felt violated. So I feel the focus here has been very different. And one of the reasons, because and most of the perpetrators, most of the alleged abusers were male and cis men at that, and cis upper caste men. One thing which had happened is I felt that especially in 2018, 2019, it's sort of the backlash was extremely huge. And I can say this because I've spoken to so many survivors at that time, because we sort of volunteered. We were sharing, all of us were sharing stories. We were sharing stories, and over again we heard stories mostly of acquaintance rape and acquaintance sexual abuse. And it because the focus was so much on the accused and less on who are the people and what sort of justice they're looking at, what sort of healing they are looking at, because it was so focused on the perpetrator, on the accused, that the backlash came in the form of cis men, pushing back, saying that this is an attack against us. And it was a very personal um, it was a very personal sort of, they took it very personally, and they should, but I felt that was like sort of a watershed movement, because it also framed the media coverage around it. It also framed the police and political response around it. One thing that we've seen is no little to no policy changes happen on ground. There are, Me Too is a moment in history. There have been NGOs working, people, lawyers like my fellow panelists, they've been working on the grassroots for ages. This work has always been there. It's just, but the moment in history was such that it was focused on this, mostly internet voices, urban internet voices, raising and sharing their stories, personal experiences throughout life. But I felt that that could have been done a little better. But at the same time, one of the most brilliant things I noticed is how common the nature of sexual harassment hasn't like sort of changed over the years, because it connected women across generations. It connected non-binary people across generations. It's the same sort of harassment. It's the same sort of abuse. It's just the platforms and the venues have changed. Um, I will probably, over questions, I'll come into this a little later on, that the young survivors versus the older feminist argument, and this will tie in with that. We're basically, the experiences just mirrored each other. It's just that the avenues have changed, and they are so. In fact, if anything, young people are so much more vulnerable now because of their technology has advanced so much. They're on so many platforms, and abusers, harassers now have that many more platforms to harass them on. So I feel it is, when we talk about solidarity, I feel that it took the form of listening to each other's stories. We always knew this happens. I don't think anybody who has experienced this in their lives will ever think that, no, it was a one-off. This sort of thing doesn't usually happen in, upper class and whatever, urban, this thing. Yes, nahi hota hai, and all of that. All of us knew it happened, but what was, I felt at the end of the day, whether we achieve anything, whether we do not achieve anything, What I feel is it made us uncomfortable, and we needed to feel uncomfortable. It made our father uncomfortable. It made our brother uncomfortable. It made me uncomfortable. It made allies who we didn't, support. The questions they raised of us made us uncomfortable, and it made us look inwards. And if a little bit of growth comes from that, a little bit of self-realization, self-awareness comes from that, that's a win. If a little bit of societal change comes in the way we address survivors, in the way we listen to their stories, in the way we believe them, um, that's a win. That's a win for us.
Thank you so much, Rituparna. You didn't take your 10 minutes, so I'm sure at the end we will give you more time to respond to some of the questions. But thank you for bringing that up. It's true that, to a large extent, the whole business of gender equality seemed to become more so mainstream that we forgot to ask the uncomfortable questions, whereas these have always been about, upsetting what has been settled. So I think it was very true of the Me Too movement that it began to unsettle and make things more complicated than we were trying to flatten things out. And I suppose these really made us very aware that these cannot be and shouldn't be kind of flattened out like that. So thank you so
Also,
much.
if I may just quickly add one thing, it's not also like we tend to imagine that justice is उसको पकड़ लिया पुलिस ने और फिर इसका जेल हो गया. Justice does not look like that. Justice has to be centered with the survivor, and that is also something we realized over the last 3 years. I mean, a lot of people started that conversation. This conversation has been happening through feminist movement over time. There have been milestones in the last 10, 20, 30 years, but I think that also what justice looks like and who should decide what justice looks like. That is a question, that is a conversation I think that has, took center stage. I'll hand it over.
Yeah, especially if you're looking at and where I'm sitting in Telangana, the response to a gang rape was that you would catch 4 people and kill them. I mean, and
Yeah.
it's presented as, one way in which you counter the whole, so you're raising questions of abuse. So here is where we can show you an image of justice. So how do we as feminists say that this is not the kind of justice that we're looking at? Yeah, that is an important question. Shall we move to Nikita? Yeah, please, Nikita, can you
Sure. Yeah.
share your reflections?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you so much for organizing this discussion and inviting me. I think the question of solidarity is very important. And, I am a lawyer, a Dalit feminist lawyer, and, I want to, my understanding of these questions are from, that standpoint. And I want to therefore, today in my opening remarks, just really locate the discussion around Me Too within the larger context of feminist engagement with law, right? And I think today, since we're discussing the power of solidarity, I think the first step and a crucial first step to building any kind of solidarity is accountability. And I think we have to take account of what are the voices that have been left out of, a discourse that we have been discussing and that has been a part of public imagination, at least the so-called mainstream public imagination for the last 3 or 4 years, right? So I want to start by doing what we do as lawyers, which is doing a due diligence of the history of the Me Too movement. And I want to talk about how it has been built on the traumas of Bahujan women, and really then go on to reflect on how the heavy reliance on criminal law and the criminal justice system has been detrimental to Bahujan communities in India, right? So we cannot talk about any question of sexual violence and particularly of sexual harassment at the workplace in India without referring to Bhavri Devi. So I want to start by talking about Bhavri Devi. Bhavri Devi worked as a Sathin, and she still continues to work as a Sathin with a state program, right? A program that was run by the government to raise awareness against child marriage. She belonged to a Bahujan community, which is known as the Kumhar caste. They are traditionally potters. And so as part of her work, she was raising awareness against child marriage. And as a retaliation to this, law students will be familiar with the facts of this case. She was gang raped by 5 upper caste men, 4 Gujjar and 1 Brahmin man. And Bhavri Devi's instance of violence, this instance of what was caste-based sexual violence became then the foundation of the PIL, which was filed by Vishakha and other NGOs in the Supreme Court, right? Now, the Vishakha judgment is significant. It's significant because, the Supreme Court recognized in passing the guidelines saying that, harassment is synonymous with discrimination, and therefore, liability lies with the employer to protect workers in both the formal and the informal sector. But what happened during this process, and which is something which is very telling which has been a sort of a permanent theme of the question around sexual violence in this country, is that the petition that was filed in the Supreme Court by these NGOs or the Supreme Court judgment made no mention of the fact that the precarity of a female worker in the workforce is compounded by the intersection of caste and gender, right? That a Bahujan woman who's a part of the workforce is obviously in a more precarious position as a result of her caste location. And the fact that in Bhavri Devi's case, the rape happened because she by upper caste men as a result of her caste location and that precarity that came with it. In fact, the accused persons in this case were acquitted by the trial court by saying that 5 upper caste men would never stoop to the level of raping a Bahujan woman. And we saw that this conversation and that sort of intersection of the precarity of Bahujan women was completely absent from the conversation that happened, from the petition and the discussions that happened in the Supreme Court, and subsequently the legislation that came into being, right? So what we saw in Bhavri Devi's case was a classic example of power rape. And the conception of power rape is something that has originated in the feminist engagement with the law a couple of years before Bhavri Devi's case, which was the case of Mathura, another case of violence against an Adivasi woman. But what we saw in this analysis, while it was an accurate analysis to say that this was an instance of power rape, what we saw and what we see absolutely lacking is that there was no analysis of the question of power against the question of a Brahminical caste system, right? And any understanding of power relationships in the context without an analysis of caste is a superficial exercise. And we've seen that happen in the way, and this sort of invisibilization, we've seen that happen in the implementation of the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, right? So we see that, well, this is a law that in principle is supposed to protect women both in the formal and the informal sector, but we've seen that local complaints committees that are supposed to respond to the grievances of women in the informal sector are only exist on paper, right? So we have about 85 to 90% of women who belong to the workforce, who are a part of the informal workforce. Most of these caste-based occupations, whether it is in the garment industry, whether it is domestic work, etc., who have been excluded from this conversation, right? And we see that happening from the beginning. So although we see that Bhavri Devi's case formed the basis of the discussion around sexual harassment at the workplace in this country, we see that in the way that this sort of discourse emerged, we see those voices being left out, right? And I think also it's important to see during this process the relationship of feminists with the law, because we start from the case of Mathura, where feminist engagement with the law is one of skepticism, and then we come to Bhavri Devi and moving forward from there, where like feminist engagement with the law has continued to grow stronger, and so has the dependence on the law, right? And I think that shift in attitude is for us very important to remember in seeing in our understanding of any kind of movement, because we saw what happened in 2012 after the rape and murder of Jyoti Pandey, right, which is the Nirbhaya case. We saw that there was a feminist demand for stringent criminal laws following this incident. And what has that done? So we saw that, there were amendments that happened to the Criminal Amendment Act, and we've seen that, after years of engaging with the system, we saw that death penalty, which was and there was a common feminist understanding across the board, which said that we're opposed to the death penalty. We saw that the death penalty was introduced for violent rape, which didn't exist prior to the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 2013, right? And we're talking about a system, a criminal justice system that in its ethos has been targeted towards Bahujan communities in the country. We have official National Crime Records Bureau data that year after year shows us that prison populations are overrepresentation of Bahujan people in the prison population, right? So what we've done is that we've really created like this sort of typology of violence we've been able to create, where we've said that the survivor is the upper caste woman, and the person, and the narrative of the person who commits the violence is essentially a man who belongs to a Bahujan community. So what we've seen happen as a result of this over dependence on law is that there has been not just been that the invisibilization of the violence against Bahujan women has been accompanied by the over criminalization of men from these communities, and it has resulted into that typology, right? And I really want to backtrack a little bit to Mathura to really talk about what I mean by this invisibilization. So Radha Kumar, in her book, which is called The History of Doing, talks about the Mathura case, and she talks about how in the aftermath of the Mathura case, on the 8th of March, on the occasion of International Women's Day, there were protests that were organized by feminist groups who call themselves the Indian Women's Movement across the country. And on the eve of these protests, which is on the 7th of March, there were some, flag bearers of this movement who realized that Mathura was never consulted about these protests. She didn't even know that these protests were happening. And so some of them reached out to Mathura and asked her if she was okay with, these protests being organized across the country around, her, her trauma and her incident of violence. And Mathura, the book says that Mathura was indifferent to it. But, what we see is that we see that in this process, that, really the survivor-centric approach that we're talking about, the Bahujan woman as a survivor and her narrative of violence is something that has been completely missed out, throughout this discussion, right? Throughout this entire building of a discourse. And we saw that happening after 2013 during, the list that Raya Sarkar compiled, right? We saw the dismissal of that list and, the sort of response that was published on Kafila. And I really want to highlight here that, that the failure of due process is what gave rise to Me Too. And we said that, systems that were put in place, legal systems failed to respond to the instances of violence against women. But we saw that what has happened during the course of the Me Too movement.
Nikita, can we make this a little shorter so that we hear Vikram and then we can come back towards
Sure. If I can just be given a minute to wrap up.
Sure.
Yeah. So we've seen that like the same way in which the problems with the feminist engagement of law have been replicated with the Me Too movement. And I really want to say that, there are some voices that have been left out by design, and which is the way that it has translated both in the feminist engagement of the law and the Me Too movement. And therefore, I would like to close with what, Dalit activist Ruth Manorama has said, that the Me Too movement was not ours, it was never meant to be. And that any conversation on solidarity will have to take into account this history.
Thank you, Nikita, for highlighting those really important, concerns about consent, because that was what has happened in Hyderabad as well. Along with the Mathura case, there was also this Ramiza B case which had happened here, which was of a sex worker who was assaulted, and nobody knew what happened to her. So although the case was a case similar to Mathura, where you had the police system being hauled up, what actually happened to her, and she kind of disappeared into the shadows and nobody ever heard from her at all afterwards, was something that came to light many years later. Can I turn to Vikram now to offer his reflections, and then we'll open up for questions.
Sure. Thank you so much to everyone who organized this. I appreciate the labor that must have gone in this, and especially the students. And it's a particular honor to come and speak at Nalsar. Two of the brightest minds that I've surrounded myself with, Akhil Kang and Sanjeev Gumpanapalli, are both alumni and students at Nalsar, and it's an honor to be invited to their institution and to just kind of touch it. I do want to mention that I come to this from a slightly awry place, which is that I have been a rather critical voice of the Me Too movement, and that I actually have I have been on university committees, internal complaints committees for about 5 years. I've done 2 years for private corporations, and currently I am in the local complaints committee at the South Delhi District Magistrate's Office. So I am very much part of the very structure that is often kind of brought down in a scarecrow formation when we talk about Me Too. And so I do want to stake that. And my other kind of stake, very importantly, is that I have 2 of my housemates currently incarcerated on false charges by this government. And so I have a particular kind of abhorrence of criminal law and of the prison industrial complex. So if all of those stakes are quite clear, and especially at the note that Nikita left us with, is to kind of rethink the idea of consent, that is where I'm actually moving towards. Because solidarity is not simply the building of new coalitions. Solidarity, as Nikita is kind of pointing for us, also involves a kind of sitting down and rethinking and reimagining some of the things that we've taken for granted, right? Our contact with new persons should not just involve our inclusion and diversity from our side, but actually should involve the work of rethinking some of the ways in which we've been doing things hitherto. And so I actually wanted to kind of speak about one of the kind of basicest things, because in some sense we cannot talk about sexual harassment without actually talking about consent, because it is simply that the absence of consent is now harassment, right? And insofar as, and so consent becomes the bare minimum, the least and the most that we are actually fighting for. And it's a kind of strange conundrum that is actually where we are. And so I really wanted to kind of think about consent for all of us as a kind of problem. And that's a problem that is deeply tied to some of the problems that haunt this movement. So we have to kind of think about, and I have to do this really quickly, so I'll be kind of quick, but we can open some of these in the question and answer. Is that when does the question of consent actually emerge? The question of consent is not actually an everyday thing, but only emerges in a moment of crises. Consent is actually irrelevant in everyday life, except when in a moment of crises. And so if we were to think about various places where our consent is actually solicited, these are all spaces also of crises. Say, for example, a hospital where you sign a consent form. In that case, you are suffering terrible amounts of pain. You need emergency situation. You are in an emergency situation and you need help. And yet the hospital says, please sign this form, and you will bloody hell sign anything that they ask you to sign because you need medical aid. And so consent here emerges as this kind of fraught space where a kind of fantasy of the sovereignty of the individual and fantasy of our control and authority is actually created, right? At precisely the moment where women feel vulnerable, are they supposed to kind of show up, have this conversation about consent, not consent, right? So it's kind of ironic that at exactly the moment where we recognize in the material conditions that women are suffering vulnerability, that our test for sexual harassment is not the organized space, but actually whether or not she consented, right? And this has been endemic to some of the things that Nikita is also raising, is that instead of actually focusing on sexual harassment at the workplace, and remember that the Vishaka guidelines are actually about the creation of a hostile environment. They're not about fixing sexual relations between men and women. That's not its project. It's not a project about psychologizing and behavior change amongst men and women. It is about hostile work conditions. But never do actually work conditions emerge in any of these conversations. the conversations about unions, the conversations about health and safety conditions at workplaces, etc., are completely missing. Remember that Bhavri Devi was a public employee, right? And so, what are the kind of protections that the government should have offered to Bhavri, apart from actually sexual autonomy? Because by kind of coming down to sex, we have actually taken away the various ways in which women find themselves in questions, in places of vulnerability, right? And so I actually I want to kind of think about this, especially because the discipline from which I emerged, which is political science, which was introduced in the introduction, in which actually consent is a kind of strange liberal fiction, right? If you actually think about consent, it emerges in conversations about the social contract. So remember, the social contract is simply like something like the constitution, right? We, the people of India, give to ourselves XYZ, XYZ. And so the social contract and there are law students here who must have done social contract theory, emerges in a state of fear, right? Emerges in a place where people are insecure, emerges in a place where there is mistrust, emerges in a place where there is imperfect altruism. And so it is in those conditions that people agree to be protected by the state, because there is complete kind of collapse of trust amongst in the social, right? And so people are worried for life and death. So if in that case, if again in that kind of hospital-esque situation that people sign to consent to the state, it does not actually mean that this consent should necessarily be supported as a good thing. And so what we really have, therefore, is that often the conversations about the various capacities and various differing norms amongst people who sign the same contract are actually missing, right? And why do I say this? I say this because generally it is the powerful set of norms that determine what the contract will mean, right? So, for example, in India, marital rape is not understood as rape, right? Or actually, sexual violence is deeply tied to this conversation about honor, right? And these are norms that women have consented to, but are rules by which women's sexuality is governed and regulated, right? And what the Me Too movement actually does is only reverse the contract, which is basically it says that instead of in a situation of vulnerability and in a situation in which men and women are together in a kind of sexual relation, we should believe women and therefore reverse the order, that we must actually consider the less powerful version of the story as the more truthful and the overpowering one, right? So what it does is that it accepts the idea of sex as contract, but what it does is it simply kind of reverses the contract to say that we must actually believe women, right? And I am saying this very clearly as about men and women, because after all, the Me Too movement is a deeply heterosexual movement. And it works on the binary of male greater than female in all situations. In all situations of power, etc., men, by sheer fact of I don't know what, which has not been actually explained, but by sheer fact of what feminists call patriarchy, one of the least explained concepts in the history of feminism, that you have men always being powerful than women, right? And that actually deeply ties with what Nikita was raising about questions about women's power, well, Dalit Bahujan women, persons, not just women, but also men, but also say how women actually are deeply participative in custodial torture, how women participate in abusing, humiliating, bullying trans women, how women's spaces have hitherto been violent spaces for trans men, and so on and so forth. So clearly this male-female binary is all rubbish, but the Me Too movement is deeply invested. And this is the other thing that we have to realize, that the Me Too movement actually emerges on the scene precisely at the moment that the Dalit Bahujan movement, the trans movement, etc., are gaining voice, right? And so Savarna women use the Me Too movement to recalibrate their resources in order to bring the question back to the simplest binary possible between men and women, a fiction again, right? And so I want to actually think really seriously about this fiction and this reversal that Me Too performs. And this is really important because what it ironically also does, at the same time that it says that the women's story should have governed, it offers a set of kind of behavioral, kind of soft masculinity framework that NGOs had kind of fixated upon since the 1990s, where they would go to rural India and teach men about how to fix relations with women. Savarna women now do this for all of us, which is they're telling men how to be with women. And what that has actually involved has been that men now should be more feminist than women themselves. Because in a situation of vulnerability, is not actually saying and is not finding herself capable of saying what she needs to say. Men should be able to read from the signs of the body and from the dynamic at work what the woman has not yet articulated, what is yet emergent, right? And so it is a violation if the man hasn't read enough signs in the woman's body and in her silence to be able to say, I should have really backed off, right? So men are supposed to be more capable of feminist readings of women's bodies than women themselves, right? So in a situation in which women find themselves powerless to be able to articulate their circumstances, men should be able to do so, and then we would have solved the problem of consent. Now,
I really hate to interrupt because like you're really going at full speed, and this is hateful to have to do to you. But can you take
quickly 1 minute then? 1 minute quickly, and I'll wrap up, right? And so therefore, what it involves is that it involves the forensics of a certain kind of teleology of rape to be read into every sexual encounter. Heterosexualization in a kind of Catherine McKinnon, Andrea Dworkin framework, where all sex, heterosexual sex, was condemned to take on the form of rape, continues into the present day, in spite of pleasure activism and so on and so forth, where precisely because all sex can land up at rape, all sex must avoid the question of rape by constantly working through the teleology of rape and reversing it backwards. That is, that all men and women must work with the forensics of reading into their body, precisely the kinds of forensics that the doctors, the medical establishment, and the judiciary will perform on the woman's body in order to test whether or not there was rape, is precisely the kind of gaze that the man is supposed to have towards the woman and that the woman is supposed to actually allow for, right? And so what it does, it retroactively creates all sex as potentially about rape. And therefore, what it does is it collapses sexual relations and criminal relations into one. And this is why the conversation on Me Too is actually not far from, but deeply tied to the carceral complex, one that is deeply tied to the increasing criminalization of sexuality, and therefore is one that in which sex can only be, in some sense, always already criminal unless proven otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vikram, for bringing in those perspectives. There's a lot for all of us to wrap our heads around. I'm sure the other panelists will have something to respond. But at this point, I think we should take questions. And can we take questions together? I think that will be easier. And then each of you can pick the questions you want to respond to, and then we will have the closing comments. So I think there's a chat here that that is open. So please put in your questions there, or if you want to unmute yourself. I don't know, Leher, is it possible for people to talk, or do they have to put in questions as typed questions?
Ma'am, they can raise their hands also, and then either they can type it on in the chat.
Okay. So I'm sure you are handling that because I can't see any raised hands or anything of that sort. Can you see if people are raising hands?
I think I see one person raising.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I did, ma'am. I did. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, you're audible. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. I'm Brajesh and I'm an advocate at Punjab and Haryana High Court. So I have a concern, just like one of us is a media person. So I just want to go to the time when this Me Too movement originated and the platform where it originated. And so we all know that social media has, like, social networking sites have become social media because of the failure of conventional media. And the main drawback is conventional media is self-regulated, and while social media is totally flawless and there is no regulation at all. So do you I want to ask my concern is that since we have seen so many mala fide incidents on social media and who have attacked people under the garb of this Me Too movement. So can we see the return of conventional media? And can women, Dalit women, and other vulnerable sections have a voice on conventional media, or social media has to be improved and the deficiencies have to be taken away?
All right, thank you for that question. Are there any other questions? I think there were a set of questions that were circulated to all the panelists, isn't it?
Yeah, we can each take one. In this, Brijesh, who did you want this question?
No, I think anyone can answer the question. I think all of us are free
Anyone
to pick
can
the
answer,
questions. Yeah, any of us can pick the
Also,
questions.
someone is writing in the chat that they can't seem to be able to raise their hand.
Yeah, I know, I saw that.
Is
So
there any
if,
way
if
in which
Can
they
you
can
just
send the
type out your
question
question?
there?
So I think what we will do is all the participants can put their questions in the box. Can we do the questions that we've circulated? If you want to respond to any one of those questions that have
Sure.
come in, then
Sure.
we will quickly take a minute each or a couple of minutes to respond to those. And in the meantime, if there are other questions,
Can I address the media part of this,
Sure.
just purely having spent like 20 years in this profession? So, and the latter half of your question, it's a good question. Problem with mainstream media is, and this has been for a very long time, where most of it is really Savarna Prakash, and they gatekeep literally all media spaces. You will only hear Dalit voices in mainstream media when Dalits tell their own stories. Otherwise, it's Savarna interpretation of their trauma. And if you see writers today, writers of gender and violence and sexual violence, and in mainstream media, if you see the writers, they're all basically all is a sweeping statement, but I will hazard that and say that they do gatekeep the traumas of other people. And unless media creates that space for them, and it is not in their interest, in 20 years, it is only now that I see independent media organizations actually putting out advertisements saying that we have one senior sub-editor position where we welcome Dalit people to apply, or we welcome non-binary people to apply for this position. I've seen a handful of that too, like very independent media. None of the mainstream media houses actually does this. I don't know why they don't. Probably it serves them better to sort of gatekeep those conversations. But till that happens, they will always run the risk of coloring stories of trauma. And this I can say. But social media is not perfect. Social media gave people told their own stories on social media, but that's also true only to a point. There are many voices who can't take that risk. Social media has a thriving, and I'm not like I wholly being deeply involved in this movement for 3 years. I was listening to Vikram, and I can't say that I don't agree with mostly all of what they're saying, because social media too is not egalitarian for all. Social media also is not safe for all. The impact that a Savarna voice has, the very reason that I'm sitting here and I'm being heard is one of that reason. And it's till we fix that, especially till we fix media spaces, I don't see that happening, to be very honest.
Also, if I could just add two things. One, that I have to make it very clear that if my name doesn't actually reveal it, I am also Savarna. And part of this kind of reflection has been to be part of reflecting on the kind of feminism that I was trained to think of as the feminism of Radha Kumar's kind of history of doing, right? And imagining that is the story of feminism. And it has taken years of work by feminists and Dalit women and other marginalized communities to be able to decenter that work, right? What I do want to say in response to that question is that it will take real gall to now say that that mainstream media in any case is not some vile qualified machine in and of itself, right? The kind of ridiculous things that go in mainstream media as this side, that side kind of stories, or the kind of reportage that we are seeing on television, etc., having private stakeholders and so on and so forth buying these channels, we simply cannot say that the media is a democratic one at all. And so in fact, one might actually be able to say that there is far more capacity for democratization in social media than there is in the hands of these private capitalists like Reliance, etc., who own so many of these channels. And many of these channels have actively supported various kinds of political parties and their campaigns and so on and so forth. So I guess this kind of distinction between regulated mainstream media and unregulated social media, and that the unregulated one is the problem and the regulated one is all right, actually for me replicates the idea of the law as the site for justice, where regulation and control is equivalent to a better, more democratic society, and all the forces that protest against it are anarchic and need to be controlled and regulated, right? Good Savarna sexuality versus all the other people who are badly disordered and so on and so forth, who need to be regulated, right? And so we might want to give up these kinds of tropes and look at various kinds of platforms. Also, I think depending on where you are, the idea of the malified sexual complaint can also be read more generously. Because when marginalized communities are offering malified complaints to get certain kind of traction, it is not the same as dominant communities doing the same, right? And we know for a fact that even in many cases, even before the emergence of social media, dominant communities would file counter charges when, say, SC/ST communities would file POA Act and so on and so forth. So let us not actually think that the realm of regulation is necessarily the realm of more democracy and more freedom. Thank you.
There are a couple of more questions, I think.
Are there?
Yeah, in the chat. How does the ICCs can hold the entire question in the process to providing justice, or the teleology of rape is attributed to all sexual activity?
Sorry, can't see this question.
Nikita, would you want to respond to any of the
Can
questions
someone read out?
earlier, or to any of this whole business about Malafide cases? And this is something that's constantly coming up, isn't it? So
Yeah.
to say that.
I think the thing with mainstream media is that in 2021, it's really become like the sort of perfect marriage between Brahmanism and neoliberal capitalism, right? And that is the one that we're dealing with. And it is to say that who is malified and what sort of complaint is malified. And Vikram has already touched upon this, is that Bahujan communities on whose backs the criminal justice system has been built have tried to negotiate these spaces in different ways, right? And which is the space of law. So there have been, as lawyers, we see this, that, each time there is an instance of saying that I want to file a complaint of violence against, by a Bahujan woman saying I want to file a complaint of sexual violence. Before that, there will always be 10 other counter complaints that will be filed to deter her from even accessing that system in the first place, right? And also the fact that the way that the law functions and the way that especially criminal law functions, the sort of carceral project that Vikram was talking about that we're confronted with, we also see the way in which it is being implemented, right? The Atrocities Act continues to be one of the most underutilized legislations in the country. A feminist movement that really loves criminal law has also not engaged with the Atrocities Act in any way. So it tells us, which laws, whose complaints, and whose voices, even within a particular framework, we have always sought to center, right?
Yeah, Leher, are there any other questions, or is this the only question that we have?
Ma'am, we have a question on the chat box also. There are two questions by the same attendee. Should I read it out for the panelists?
No, I think we can see the question, which is talking about the ICC's hold the entire question in the process to providing justice. So the teleology of rape is attributed to all sexual activity. So I think maybe Vikram can answer this, having been on local complaints committees as well. How does this actually work out? How does the ICC function in this context?
I mean, it's a
And the
very
second question
long,
is just yeah,
long-winded
the second
answer.
I know. Let me just add, I think the second question is also important because it is saying that instead of organizing, it's becoming about, regulation, and it's becoming about processes and systems rather than about, raising voices. I think the two questions are related about how does the process deal with both of these questions?
No, I think the second question is about instead of actually critiquing the Me Too movement, how do we organize better instead of like having reactionary formations around it? So I think it's a very different question and would tie in with the larger conversation around solidarity that one is trying to have. So I would leave those questions to perhaps Ritu and to Nikita. I will just take up the. I mean, I really don't have an answer because honestly, it's like saying like when if someone was asked a question about what it means to be a student in India. Like that's such a big formation that I'm having to hold. The ICCs, I can say, depending on who else was on the committee, depending on which university or which magistrate, which private body, etc., their capacities, etc., completely change. And also but what I was speaking about the teleology of rape is not really about the ICCs. What the teleology of rape is that is about what we might now call good sex. Good sex is the absence of rape, right? It is when and what is consent? Consent is that consent is a formation of avoiding rape in some sense, right? And so since consent is the only explanation for rape, so its presence means non-rape, its absence means rape. And this literally is the form in which we are dividing what sex is okay and that we don't actually discuss, which is the bad sex that heterosexuals have all the time, and what sex is not okay, which is the criminal sex that they're all having. So the conversation has been that how can heterosexuals continue to have the bad sex that they're having by avoiding the really bad sex of rape, right? And so what we're doing is that all sex has to negotiate not questions of pleasure, desire, and other vulnerabilities, etc., but actually just skirt around the question of how to get consent for how to achieve a status of consent in order to not be raped. And so rape actually is the final kind of determinant to decide everything else beforehand. And there's a way in which the blurriness of everything that is not rape is completely ignored, right? All the other kinds of convoluted manipulations, etc., that happen even in consensual sex are actually not subject to any kind of critique because rape is what we are trying to address, and or even harassment, right? Because there's very little distinction between sexual violence, rape, harassment, and assault in these conversations, and often testimonies after testimonies would layer one on the other, and we are therefore back to a kind of 1970s feminism that was championed by white women who continue to champion the conversation on trafficking, the likes of Catherine McKinnon, who therefore give no agency for sex workers to figure out, say, workplace conditions of sex work, etc., and collapse everything into trafficking and into the humiliation of women. And really, the Me Too movement is actually not very different from that frame. And that's where I was going. It's not so much the ICCs that are doing it, but actually the radical movement that is saying that we are not the ICCs, we hate due process, etc., that is actually falling into this framework far more, is my submission.
May I add to what Vikram is saying? I think what has happened with this movement is that it subscribes to the same logic of oppression that the criminal legal system does, right? So ultimately, when a woman says she has been violated, she has to negotiate the legal standard of consent, which has become synonymous with the understanding of harm. I mean, questions of desire, pleasure, etc., are nowhere I mean, they're not on the table at all, right? But even if we were to say the question of harm and harm alone, even within that limited sense, it is that legal definition of harm that we're negotiating with. And how have we interpreted that legal definition of harm? By the consent standard. And it's a consent standard that is completely entrenched within the Brahminical notion of harm, right? Which is to say, Mahila, honorable, virgin, chaste, which is to say, basically, the woman who can be harmed is the Brahmin woman, is the honorable Brahmin woman whose virtue is robbed and whose honor is taken away. So, everybody else who is trying to negotiate with this system is automatically going to fall through the cracks and is going and what the Me Too movement is doing is really subscribing to the logic of this system and replicating it in different ways, because it is ultimately in so many ways a legacy bearer of the feminist movement, right, which has constantly tried to negotiate and revolve around this system. So I think, when I was asked to be a part of this conversation, we were told, voices that we have left out and that we need to take account of. I think this like neoliberal trickle down theory doesn't work when it comes to, it doesn't work in any case, but especially won't work when it comes to understanding questions of harms and violation, right? The fact that, that the entire game is rigged, right? The entire vocabulary has been framed in so many ways only to suit the definitions of Savarna upper caste women who have ultimately become gatekeepers, and the rest of us are really just trying to work with whatever else we have and trying to work our way around it. And I think that is what we have to really take stock of if we are even to approach the question of solidarities in any way.
Yeah, Rituparna, do you have any?
I'll just add like one thing to that. If there is anything that is not, it's just my personal feeling over 3 years of looking at this very closely. If there is anything that isn't homogeneous, it is what this movement that we term. It's not homogeneous. It's people to say that it's all Savarna upper caste women gatekeeping it, talking about their trauma. It's you're seeing it. That's your opinion. That's fine. But at the end of the day, there's also people who want to share a story, share an experience, and I personally, I'm very opposed to this idea of this pressure, intense pressure to also pressure of disclosure. That because it's a movement, everybody, because it causes untold harm later on. It has a lot of fallout that those safety net is not there in our country. There is no safety net against defamation lawsuits, criminal defamation lawsuits. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of rights that are taken for granted elsewhere. It's not there in our country. But one thing which I feel has happened, and this is just purely out of my personal opinion, is it has given a space to an ordinary person to sort of talk about certain things which weren't easy to talk about. Let's just say that. She could be a Savarna upper caste person, she could be a cis person, she could be a queer person, they could be non-binary people, but it's just that the time and the way it swept through, there were no rules like this. There were no rules. Nobody did it before in India. Nobody figured out what was happening. There is no template. There weren't any template for it. All of us made mistakes. All of us fumbled. All of us. There were a lot of experiences that shouldn't have been shared that people have regretted sharing. There could have been a lot more voice. It's an understatement, and it's irony to say this, but there could have been a lot more voices, a lot of diverse voices, which was missing, as both of them have rightly pointed out. But one thing it has done is it's their trauma of anyone was diminished. Trauma of anyone was diminished for a long, like the male violence and the sexual harassment of the incidents that people spoke of has been always been there. But I feel a little, I come from a position of empathy, and when I look at it, it simply means to me that if it gives even one person solace to negotiate the story on their terms, and if this movement or whatever this is made up of multiple voices, if it gave them that bit of space, then it worked for them. For those it didn't work for, are equal stakeholders of this and have done absolutely right in their way. But I do feel that we'll be diminishing a lot of people's trauma if we say that this is, this is nonsense, and this is, it's talking in gender binaries, and it's only Savarna upper caste people who were sharing these stories. Actually, it was not just Savarna upper caste people who were sharing their stories. A lot of people shared these stories. My only thing from this is that we need to look at how we discuss survivor stories. I feel that's a massive gap. It's always the taking away and the silencing of voices. And it's always interpretative, like who is telling their stories. That's something I have a major problem with. And the platforms were such that that's how it happened. That's how it happened. The platforms are unsafe. It's unsafe for a lot of people to tell their stories. Let's just.
Thank you, Rituparna. And if I can just weigh in with my own experience with the Telugu film industry, when we had, persons who were in the lowest of the hierarchies who were speaking up against really powerful people. So I think it's more than Savarna women claiming their spaces, though I'm sure that I'm not trying to deny that that did not happen. And you did not go back to a 1970s kind of.
Of course it happened.
It's true, but I think it has more layers than that we must acknowledge. So I think we should bring this to a close. There's one question there, which is from the PPG itself. How do we locate the complicated relationship of queer persons with the interrelation of sexual and criminal in the context of the Me Too movement? So can we have like a couple of minutes from all the panelists answering this, or any other thing that you want to respond to, or you want to say something, and we really need to bring this to a close.
Ma'am, there is one more person who has raised their hand, Smriti. If we'll be able to take their question also.
Sure.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're.
Hi. Okay, so my question is, so when the Me Too movement, I was introduced to the Me Too movement, I was still back in school, and I was sexually harassed when I was around 11 to 12 years old. So when I saw these posts of the Me Too, and I basically blocked it out in this space in my head. And then when I saw these posts on Facebook, I was introduced to it early on. I saw these posts, and then I realized that, you know what, this was not my fault. There was always this sense of guilt that victims are fed into, looking at the kind of patriarchal structure that the family takes or the school takes. And so that happened then, which I'm very grateful for, and I recognize my privilege when I had access to that movement and the internet in general. But it was very necessary for me to be able to actually acknowledge that I wasn't. And my question is, how do you think as feminists we can extend this cause? You know, we can extend conversations, and because I've been trying, but I really don't know how on a worldwide way, or on such a large scale as the Me Too movement has done. How do you think we could, do this so that many child victims also will be able to speak out, because they're the ones who are usually silent. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. So can we have a quick round of responses? Shall we start with Vikram this time round, and then we'll do the reverse order?
There are lots of questions that I need really long time to answer. So I would suggest anyone get in touch with me personally, and we can have that conversation. Because this is also closing arguments, I want to say two really clear things. One is that Smriti, as a young person, actually, because of the nature of the movement, were you to come out of the testimony, you would not actually be part of the conversation and consent, because as a young child, you would not be able to, in a condition to offer consent, right? And because we haven't actually had a conversation about sexuality, but only about the conversation of consent, the movement worked for you is purely accidental, right? And so I want to actually speak to this last thing really about people saying, one is that I'm kind of tired to be invited to other people's parties, right? So it's because what actually in the same place that our hosts are, there was this massive murderer and exploiter of trans women called Venkat Yadav, who was going around and harassing and murdered some trans women and exploiting them. This was exactly at the time of the Me Too movement. And the trans movement in the country, especially the trans women's movement, floated a hashtag called Arrest Venkat. Now, you would imagine that getting on the backs of the Me Too movement, we would get some traction. If actually even till today you go and see the number of tweets on Arrest Venkat, it's 150. Now, one could say that this is sheer happenstance, but actually one would say that this is precisely the workings of power. What Nikita and I are trying to emphasize is that the horizontality that is imagined in a kind of coalitional politics and solidarity politics does not actually exist. What we're trying to name are actually oppressors that pretended to be the oppressed, right? Savarna women who hegemonized the space of all oppression and thereafter invited other people to that party. And what one had to do, therefore, was to reframe their conversation in their narrative. Trans women do not suffer sexual exploitation in the same way that Savarna women do. If you were to kind of think about the kinds of sexual violence trans women experience, which is a sexual violence, one, largely from the police state, two, completely devoid of conversations of honor because most of them are sex workers and working on the street and homeless. And therefore, the rights of privacy, etc., don't apply, and they don't have the protection of Savarna men. And three, the nature and gravity of that violence, where after sexual violence, there would be burns, there would be cuts, there would be sexual assault, and there would be violence itself, are not actually what Savarna women in this conversation were having, right? And fourth, most importantly, there were no workplaces where trans women were working because there are no workplaces where trans women are working. Trans women are not in our offices. Trans women are at most what peons and wardens and so on and so forth. So to say that they can be equal stakeholders would actually be a complete misrecognition of power that was at work. And what one therefore submits to people who defend this movement is to take this time and see their complicity in causing greater oppression, even as they were alleviating that of their own. That would be my last word. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram. Yeah, Nikita?
Yeah. To just take on from what Vikram was saying, that, we cannot talk about any movement or any semblance of a movement until, Savan women take stock and confront their own role as perpetrators of violence, right? Which is, and I don't see why we have to constantly juxtapose and say that Savan women can be at the receiving end of harm while also being perpetrators. These are not mutually exclusive phenomenon. And as Vikram was saying, we have waited and we have waited for a really long time for this movement to encompass us all, right? And we have arrived at this space and at this point to say that this movement in its ethos, and I don't, the feminist the Me Too movement obviously as an extension of the feminist engagement with law, because I don't see them as being separated by their differentiation over the question of due process, right? I see this as being a byproduct of the feminist engagement with law. We see that these are movements that have been built on the backs of Bahujan people. The reason why I was talking about the Atrocities Act earlier, in 2006, the Khairlanji case happened in Maharashtra, where an entire Dalit family, including 2 women of the family, were paraded, raped and murdered by an entire group of dominant caste men. Sexual violence provisions weren't even invoked. A movement at a time, and a feminist movement that has now almost, I don't even think we should call them a movement anymore. It's a pressure group when it comes to the state. That was engaging so enthusiastically with the state, did not even involve itself or has never involved itself in the multiple atrocity cases that have come up in since 1989, since this law has existed. And I think it is to really recognize that and to understand that, we cannot do this work until we challenge Brahmanism and until Savarna women realize that they're complicit in this Brahmanism. Intersectionality in the last couple of years has really become this buzzword, right? And everybody wants a stake in that conversation. Intersectionality, in the conversation around intersectionality, I just want to say caste is not a mere axis of power in the Indian subcontinent. It is the genesis of power. And I think any sort of intersectional analysis that we subject anything to has to be cognizant of that and has to be mindful of that. And about the question that the student asked earlier, this is precisely what a law like POCSO has done, right? POCSO today has been used to incriminate young intercaste couples who have tried to get married. POCSO has been used against young queer couples at this point. We are in the middle of responding to a case of two Adivasi women, two lesbian women, one of whom has been charged under the POCSO Act. So POCSO doesn't recognize the agency of anyone, and nor do criminal law. And in whatever limited sense that we understand agency and harm that it does in the purely Brahmanical sense of it. And I think that understanding has been made clear several times over. And if we are choosing to not, apply our minds to it, then it is not accidental, it's deliberate. Yeah.
Yeah, Rituparna.
To sum it all, one thing that obviously through this 1.5 hour long conversation is also ironically something that happened in the last 3 years during the Me Too movement as well, whether we acknowledge it or not. But even if it happened to a minuscule section of us, I absolutely agree with Nikita what she said about, and we have to bring uncomfortable conversations about caste, about Savarna, upper caste people, and also about listening, also about not coming from a defensive space, also not finding reasons to further alienate and further, and one thing that can lead to that is recognizing the power. One thing that can lead to that is understanding that who leads the voices in these platforms, acknowledging that. And I think if we listen, if we come from a position of empathy, if we come from that position of willing to listen to start with, before we reverse years of injustice, just begin to listen. I think that's a start, and that's all I have to say at this moment.
Okay, so I don't think there is any way in which I can offer any concluding remarks, because we've had, I think we also started off with a very ambitious agenda. I think one of the things that we were talking about is what kind of solidarities and how solidarities, and obviously that is a conversation that will take a lot of effort and a lot more talking before we can actually answer those questions. But I think it's been a very, very useful beginning. Even if we want to talk about solidarities, I think we need to listen to each other before we can talk about what do we mean by solidarity, or what solidarity means for each of us. So thank you all so much for giving your time. Thanks to all the participants and the public policy group. It's been a conversation that is long awaited, but it has been worthwhile, because we've had some really excellent speakers who really made the whole conversation worthwhile. So thank you all at the PPG. Yeah, Leher, do you want to say anything at the end?
So thank you all for joining us today. As young women and non-binary folks soon to enter workplace, this talk has surely been very enlightening in more than one way. We have heard and absorbed the various points of discussion stirred by all our panelists. I'm sure that all of us have something to take away and some food of thought to think about. I would like to thank all our panelists for us today and sharing with us some wonderful insights. I would also like to thank Professor Vasanti for moderating the panel discussion. Thank you for engaging and asking pertinent questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.